Hey guys, welcome back to my channel, Coventry Grace. My name is Nora. Let's study the Bible. It's been a little bit since I last posted because I have been working on creating an updated version of the study guide I was working out of, and I'm super happy to say that these are available for purchase on Amazon. This is the one that I'm using right now. There are 3 total designs, including this one. You can see them right here. They are $15.99, and I have linked all 3 in the video description below. What's different about these study guides is they're not particular to a certain book of the Bible. They're just OIA study guides. You can use them for any book of the Bible that you happen to be studying. If you have been studying Genesis along with me, we are now up to chapter 6. We are using the OIA method of Bible study. If you are new to my channel and aren't familiar with this method, the What to Expect video is always linked. That video goes over my intentions for this channel and also has a method overview. I also always link the OIA resource that dives deep into the method itself. Genesis chapter 6 is titled Increasing Corruption on Earth and Noah and the Flood in my Bible. Something I mentioned that I will be doing from here on out is to start off with a summary of the chapter. So if you haven't read chapter 6 yet, pause the video and do that now because we are going straight into our summary section of the passage. The easiest way to write a summary of any passage is to focus on the subject and the verb. Are you having flashbacks to English class yet? You want to write down who did what or who said what. That will paint a very broad picture of what's going on. My summary was this. And I'm just going to read straight through what I wrote down, but this is the cover of the guide that I'm using. Let me get to that page. I said, man multiplied, sons of God took daughters of man as wives. God shortened the lifespan. The Nephilim were on earth and were quote-unquote mighty. God saw wickedness of man and wanted to wipe them out. Noah found favor in the eyes of God. God told Noah his intent to wipe out his creation. He tells Noah to build the ark. He says he will establish his covenant with Noah. Noah is given specific instructions on how to build the ark and what to bring into it. Noah did all that was commanded of him. After our summary, we're going to move straight into observation. Observation asks, what does the text say? We can divide up this really big question into 3 different categories. Info about the author, info about the passage, and info about God and man. Within each of those categories, we're going to ask questions to expand our observations. So, info about the author. This is still Moses writing. We know that he is a big deal. He has intimate knowledge of God, as we'll see later in the Bible when we get to Moses' story. But this is a man who spent a lot of time in communication with God. He is the one telling us this story. Info about the passage. The bulk of this chapter is Moses describing a specific interaction between God and Noah. He describes the world as it was in that time and then moves into talking about the interaction. To really nail down the structure itself, think about it like this. There is a situation on earth that was caused by sin. Remember, we're post-fall at this point. Then there is God's reaction to that situation, in this case, his judgment. Then there are consequences given because of that judgment. Breaking down the structure of the passage is going to help us move through it more effectively with our observations and then in turn help us with our interpretation section. We see some resemblance between the language that's used here and early on in Genesis. Sons of God saw and took echoes what happened in Genesis 3:6 when Eve saw and took the apple. Nephilim are described as mighty men and men of renown. There's more parallel language in verses 19 and 20 when God is instructing what animals to bring. He says, of the birds according to their kinds and the animals according to their kinds. Much the same as in Genesis 1:11 and 12 when he was ordering creation. Info about God and man. God is described as being regretful and grieving in this chapter. The evil in the world grieved him to his heart, so much so that he wants to blot out everything he made. Noah is being described as the complete opposite of the rest of mankind in this chapter. Noah walks with God just as Enoch did. When God is instructing Noah to build the ark, he's given a lot of details in those instructions. He's told the type of wood to use and to seal it with pitch. He's told how many floors to make and where to put the doors. Noah is told that God will establish a covenant with him, and God explains how he will provide for Noah and his family. Once we've made our observations about the author, passage, and God and man, we can move into the interpretation section of the study. Interpretation asks us, what does the text mean? We can interpret scripture by asking ourselves specific questions about all of the different observations that we made. The questions we're going to ask are these: why did the author write this passage? Why were certain things emphasized while others were not? What does the passage reveal about the character of God and the character of man? What does the author want us to do with the information he has just given us? Like, does it help us form an opinion about something in particular, or does it maybe switch our opinion? We might have previously thought about something a certain way, but now that we're digging into it deep, it changes our perspective on it. And if this sounds like a whole lot, don't forget that in the very front of all of these study guides, all of this is laid out in the prompt pages. The biggest tip that I can ever give is that you want to use scripture to interpret scripture, meaning use what you already know to determine what you're trying to figure out. My goal here is to make understanding the Bible accessible and to not seem as scary as it sounds. This was the first time that I was able to articulate an answer to that big question, why did the author write this? Well, to me, it was to explain the need for God's judgment. The very first sentence in my summary was, man multiplied. On the face of it, that doesn't seem like a bad thing, right? This was the blessing that God gave. We were put on the earth to multiply and be fruitful, right? Well, don't forget that that blessing was given pre-fall. Now we are post-fall, after sin was brought into the world. We need to be aware that when we are reading about something that man has done, there's a very real possibility that it came from a blessing that the presence of sin twisted. Isn't that sin's very nature? Twisting and making perverse something that was originally meant for good. So man may have multiplied, but so did sin. I use Matthew Henry's commentary as my resource, shocker, from the BibleGateway.org, and he wrote this. Now here we have an account of two things which occasioned the wickedness of the old world. The increase of mankind, men began to multiply upon the face of the earth. This was the effect of the blessing, and references Genesis 1:28, and yet man's corruption so abused and perverted this blessing that it was turned into a curse. And again, I'm just on BibleGateway.com. I think I said .org previously, but I'll link it below. Side note here, rather than share my whole interpretation and then go to the resource I use to check myself, I'm going to make interpretations about the observations and then show how I check them as I go along. For me, this just makes more sense for our purposes. Okay, moving on. The sons of God took daughters of man that they found attractive. I observed the similarities between the language of this description in Genesis 3:6 when Eve saw the apple and took it because it looked good to her to eat. Disaster followed that decision, and I don't think it's a coincidence that the same language was used here. Taking something on sight alone feels like, at least for me, maybe a perceived right to that which you are taking that isn't necessarily for good. And that's a great example of how you use scripture to interpret scripture. I looked back in Genesis because the language was similar, and I wanted to see if what was implied was actually true. In this case, it was. The observation about Nephilim, where they were described as mighty men of renown. So this term, men of renown, means men who were exalted. They were set above the other people on the earth in that time. It makes sense to use this description to infer that these men were warriors, possibly leaders, probably leaders, if they were exalted above other men and large in stature. In a corrupt world, we can almost certainly expect corrupt leaders. Attitude reflects leadership, right? All of these details are here to help us to understand the state of the world at this time. Moses spends time describing how God felt when he saw his creation. We have to remember that God sees all, right? He doesn't just see actions, he sees the intent, and what he saw made him regret his creation. To want to destroy something that you created so lovingly tells us how God sees sin with a just and a holy abhorrence. The juxtaposition of this passage in Genesis chapter 2, when he rested and looked on all he created and took joy in it, is very, very stark. Matthew Henry wrote this. Here is God's resentment of man's wickedness. He did not see it as an unconcerned spectator, but as one injured and affronted by it. He saw it as a tender father sees the folly and stubbornness of a rebellious and disobedient child, which not only angers him but grieves him and makes him wish he had been written childless. Moses describes God's disdain for sin so effectively, it really brings our sin to the forefront of our minds, doesn't it? Just as we are wallowing in how bad the world is, there is a bright spot when we come to read about Noah. The text says that Noah walked with God the same way Enoch walked with God. It means that his intentions were good and honorable, and his actions reflected that. Our trusted commentary says this: perfect, not with a sinless perfection, but a perfection of sincerity. And it is well for us that by virtue of the covenant of grace upon the score of Christ's righteousness, sincerity is accepted as our gospel perfection. He walked with God as Enoch had done before him. He was not only honest but devout. He walked, that is, he acted with God as one always under his eye. The observations I made about the instructions that God gave to Noah about how to build the ark showcase his unique, intimate provision. Just like he explained the creation process, Moses is including and almost emphasizing the details that God communicates to Noah. When we know the measurements, we can understand just how massive the ark really was, and we can appreciate this story in a whole new way. Matthew Henry wrote about this particular provision in such a beautiful way. He said, God gave him very particular instructions concerning this building, which could not but be admirably well fitted for the purpose when infinite wisdom itself was the architect. Nobody writes like that anymore. I got curious because I don't know what cubits are, and thanks to Google, I got a clear answer when I searched the dimensions of the ark. Just in case you didn't know, it was roughly 510 feet long, 85 feet wide, and 51 feet high, or about as long as 1.5 football fields, which absolutely blows my mind. The very last sentence in the chapter stood out to me, and I don't think I mentioned it in my observation. Verse 22 says, Noah did this. He did all that God commanded him. Do you guys remember in previous chapters that Moses wrote a dialogue between God and Adam and Eve, or between God and Cain? And there is no dialogue here. It's safe to say that if there was any kind of conversation, Moses would have recorded it. He's not an author to leave anything out, which leads me to believe that Noah obeyed without question and without hesitation. It further explains why Noah was blameless in his generation. A main idea is 1 to 2 true sentences that encompass all that you have learned. The main idea for this chapter stared me in the face from the beginning, and it was extremely short and blunt, and that is, God is just. And the evidence of that is overwhelming here. Once we've interpreted the passage we've read and used a resource or two to check ourselves, it's time to move on to application. Application asks, what does the text require? You can look at application in 2 different ways, inward and outward. Inward application asks if there is a particular sin that needs to be addressed, or maybe there's a promise that you need to believe in. Outward application asks what you could do for others in light of what you just learned. For me, this was a very intense reminder of how much God hates sin and how thankful I am for Jesus. There is no way that I am any better than the people that perished in the flood. Maybe my actions aren't corrupt, but I'm still a child born into a sinful world. It's only through Jesus that I am redeemed. This wraps up our study of Genesis chapter 6, and I am eager to hear from you guys. I hope you'll decide to comment and tell me what you thought of this chapter and how you applied it. All of the resources mentioned here are always linked in the video description. I hope you guys like the video and subscribe to my channel. It helps push it out to people who might be searching for a way to study the Bible. Next up is Genesis chapter 7. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys come back.